How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another video. So in this one I'm going to be carving a simple sailboat in shallow relief. It's going to be carved out of white pine here. It's about 2 inches thick, about 12 inches long and 10 inches high. Again, it's going to be shallow relief, so we're not going to use that whole 2 inches. We'll probably get maybe a quarter, maybe a little bit more in some areas. But yeah, so it's going to be a tutorial. It's going to be more of a long format video. I'm going to kind of explain my tools and some of the thought processes that I'm thinking about as I'm going about the carving. So feel free to follow along and take in whatever you feel is useful to you. I'm going to do my best to stay out of the way of the camera so you can see as much as you can. But the first thing I do after I get my design figured out, I sketch it and do a final drawing onto freezer paper. I find that it is far more durable than regular paper, and it's relatively cheap compared to, I don't know, some more higher quality sketch paper. You can press down relatively hard on it as well, and you're not going to poke through just because of the durability and that plasticky side to the paper. So I get it sketched out on the freezer paper here, figure out where I want it on the project, and then I get this graphite paper from Hobby Lobby and I trace the design onto the wood with this. So I'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so after I get it relatively decent onto the wood here, I'll go over it again if I have to with the pencil. It actually did a pretty good job of outlining everything. But if it comes in a little bit faint, I'll just go over it again with the pencil to make it really stand out. So I'm going to quickly go over all the tools and things that you're going to need to get this carving completed. As far as gouges go, I got these gouges several years ago now, but this came in as a set with file. Okay, except for this bench chisel here, but these all came in one standard set. You should be able to do the whole carving with just these. This one, I don't know when I bought it, but this helps just with the straight lines to get those nice and straight. So this is nice to help carve, but it's not necessary to get this particular carving done. But any sort of standard set that has a variety of gouge sweeps that range from the low 2/3s to the upper 7 and 8s, and in between, you should be able to get this carving done. So I've got a number 2, number 5, number 7, and a number 8. Those are more of the wider ones that I have, and then I've got two small ones that are probably 4 or 5 millimeter. It's number 3 and a number 7. And then I've got a V gouge, and then a skew here. The skews are really nice because they can kind of help get into the small crevices and stuff that some of the bigger gouges can't get to. The things you'll need besides the gouges, this isn't necessarily a need, but it helps, is a mallet here. And then I use the graphite paper as I showed you earlier to get the carving onto the wood. And then I use a wire brush to kind of help get rid of some of the fuzzies and little pieces that sometimes get lodged. And then this isn't a need, but this helps. It kind of helps with the sanding and getting rid of some of the high spots and getting rid of some of the gouge stroke marks. This is really nice because you can take the pieces out and then replace it with a different sized blade, or I guess it's called a scraper, different sized scraper or different profile. So I use that to kind of get rid of some of the high spots and help with the sanding. And then I usually use, if you really need to work at it, I'll use 180 grit sandpaper. And then some more of the fine tuning, I use 320. This should be all that you relatively need to get this done. Here's the design for those of you that want to follow along. You can copy it somehow. So after I get the design transferred onto the wood, I'll outline the design with my V-gouge. Because this is shallow relief, there's nothing that you really have to be too careful about in this stage. You can go relatively quickly. You just got to make sure you're carving on the right side of the line. Usually during this step, I give myself maybe a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch away from the line. That kind of helps. That kind of gives you a little buffer room, just in case the wood starts to split out on you, or if you need to make any sort of corrections, or if you just kind of do a miscarve or something and you get a little too close. That just gives you a little buffer room. Basically, this step is just do a rough outline and start establishing the layers in the carving. Because this is shallow relief, there's really just one layer. So the design basically just tapers into each other. That's why it's important, again, to carve on the correct side of the line. Because if you make a mistake, a lot of times shallow relief is difficult to correct those mistakes. But because of the size of the wood that I have almost 2-inch thick piece of wood. It's salvageable basically, but it just helps prevent any extra time spent on the carving later or any headaches. A lot of times during this first stage of this outline, I'll use my mallet to get a good, precise stroke around the design, and it prevents slipping. A lot of times if you try to muscle your way through this stage, it oftentimes can lead to slipping, and you end up cutting into the design. So that's why I use my mallet during this first outline. In this carving, there are 3 particular areas that I think you need to pay close attention to and kind of methodically work your way through those areas very carefully. The first spot is the tip of the vertical post. The second is where it's an area where several layers kind of connect, which is where the sky connects to the water, and then where those two connect to the sailboat. And then the third is where the front and back portions of the sailboat meet the water layer. And I'll kind of break those areas down and talk about those more in depth when I get to those spots. The birds are another particular area that you kind of have to be careful. If you are going too fast, like I said, you can cruise through this particular portion of the carving relatively quickly. But if you do it too fast and without really thinking about what you're doing, you can easily chip out one of the wings to the birds. So you kind of have to methodically outline the birds as well. Oftentimes I don't take off very much. When I was doing the birds here, I just would take out a little bit at a time. I'm not trying to be too greedy. Also, I'm not going right up against the line. If there's some tight spots, what I'll usually do is shallow out my stroke in relation to the tight corner. That'll leave a decent space there to work with. And then when I'm readdressing the birds, I'm going to do a fine, detailed stop cut outline. That's when I'll address those tight spots. Right now I'm just outlining the design and establishing the depths within the carving. I'll just speed the carving up here a little bit and we'll move on to the next step. What I'm doing here is tapering the surrounding area of the sailboat and just starting to slowly work back the background and establish the depth of the sailboat and how deep I want it to be. In this particular situation, I'm thinking about 1/4 of an inch to maybe 3/8, just depending, because you have to kind of adjust in certain areas, especially where the different layers meet. But I tend to do this tapering stage just because it makes your stop cuts a lot easier to make later in the carving when you want to do a precise outline. I'm just working my way around here, carving the taper and establishing the depth of the sailboat, allowing it to pop out from everything else. This first pass, I'm probably at about a depth of maybe 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to be doing several more passes to get down to the depth that I want to be. Like I said, I'd like to get down to maybe 1/4 or 3/8, somewhere in that range. I'm just kind of going back and forth here between my V-gouge and my number 7 14 millimeter. I'll take my V-gouge and carve away the depth along the edge of the sailboat, and then I'll take my number 7 14 millimeter and do that tapering process and clean up that hard line that was left from the V-gouge. And I just work this combination around the sailboat until it's at the depth that I would like to be at. Addressing one of these key points in the carving where the two ends of the sailboat meet the water layer, what I did was I gradually tapered from that junction point where the layers meet, very gradually into the carving. If I tried going straight down there and did more of a stop cut, it's going to create a really hard line there that is going to be really difficult to get rid of if it's not looking right. So I just did a gradual taper there, which gives me some more room to work with, some more wood to properly shape this particular area. I continue to work on this depth and tapering process until I get down to about where I'd like to be at. I work my way around the birds and get rid of those hard lines around the 3 birds there and taper along there as well. The birds, you don't necessarily have to get super deep because It's just more of an accent piece to the carving. You don't need a whole lot of depth there, so I just do one pass around the birds. But eventually I'll get to a point where I won't be able to use my V-gouge anymore because the carving is getting too deep. So at that point I'll have to transition to a stop cut method. To get into these tight areas of the carving, I used a combination of my number 3 5mm, my number 7 4mm, my skew gouge, and occasionally my V gouge. There's really no right or wrong way of doing it. It just comes down to whatever works best for you. I'm gonna keep this sped up here to get to the next stage in the carving. But what I'm doing throughout is continuing this tapering process and working the depths, working on the birds and tapering around the birds. I'm not being too fussy, just getting that general shape established throughout the carving. So after I get that tapering done and I get the depths down to about where I want them to be, I start doing a precise stop cut outline around the design, starting here with the sailboat, as that's the most important part of the carving. I really take my time here and I make sure that I'm getting right along the edge of the line there. I'm also making sure that my strokes are as vertical as I possibly can get them. If they're slightly sloping in or sloping out, it's going to throw the look of that particular area off as I start shaping it. So it's really important to keep those stop cuts vertical. And then I'll go and I'll clean up those stop cuts, making a perpendicular cut into it to remove those pieces of wood. I'm using my number 2 12mm gouge here. That's the chisel that I found to match the profile of the sailboat here in this particular area. You often can get by with other gouges or gouges that are close to the profile but not quite. You can still make it work. But obviously it's best case scenario when you have a gouge that perfectly matches the profile of the design. In areas where you know the carving is particularly strong, especially around the 2 sails here on the sailboat, you can use your mallet to do your stop cuts. I'm not worried at all about chipping something out or breaking something, but when I start carving and doing my stop cuts around the tip of that vertical post there, and then around the point of the sail where it connects to the ship or the part of the sailboat, you have to really be careful, and oftentimes I don't even consider using my mallet there, as it's gonna chip out if you use it. So you just gotta use a smaller gouge and take out little pieces of wood at a time until you get that vertical cut. So I'll make that stop cut stroke with the number 2 gouge, and then in this tight spot here I'll clean it up with my V gouge or skew, or like I said earlier, my number 3 5mm or my number 7 4mm, really just whatever works. On this straight post here going vertical, I'm using my bench chisel. That's a great tool to keep those strokes nice and straight. to really get into these tight spots along the post and the sail, I use my skew gouge quite a bit and make those stop cuts with the skew gouge. And then it's not pretty by any means. I'm sure other tools would probably work better in these particular situations, but you just gotta make it work with whatever you have. And the skew gouge, regarding this set that I have, is probably the best thing to clean up that tight spot. You're not going to be able to get anything else in there. So I just kind of pick at it a little bit with my skew, and I go back and forth between that and some of my smaller gouges that I have until it's how I want it to be. But it's relatively tedious going back and forth between the two or three gouges. But if that's all you have, then you don't really have any other way of doing it. I just do the same thing here on the bottom portion of the sail and the post. You just work back and forth with your skew and your small gouges to clean up those tight spots. Along the bottom portions of the sail here, I used my number 5 12 millimeter. For some reason, I don't have it filmed doing the stop cut, but that seemed to match the profile of this area the best. Now, a really small bench chisel would have worked really well for this particular spot, but I don't have that. My bench chisel that I have is too wide for this spot, so I'm just working at it a little bit at a time with my number 3 5 millimeter. And this particular point right here, it was what I was mentioning earlier about how you really have to be careful when making these stop cuts, because you're easily gonna chip out that tip of the sail. So I would really avoid using my mallet here and just really slowly work through that area with your small gouges. Just take little bits of wood out at a time. You want to avoid applying any kind of pressure against that tip of the sail. You really have to be careful, because it's going to chip if you apply any sort of significant pressure to it. I know a lot of people in the carving community tell you not to pry or anything like that, but with pine, it's soft, and obviously if a chip is really in there, like, you can tell if it's tight in there or if it's loose. So you can sometimes get away with prying if the piece is just almost. I would avoid prying as much as you possibly can, but in certain situations you can get away with it without doing any kind of damage to your chisels. Similar to how I carved those other two tight spots along the vertical post, here I am applying the same method. I'm just going back and forth between my skew gouge and my smaller gouges, my number 3 and number 5, until I get this tight area carved away and nice and clean. Again, it's not necessary, but a great chisel to have when carving these straight areas of the design is a bench chisel. It's obviously good to have different sizes. I just have one right now, but it really helps me keep that straight edge when doing this horizontal section of the sailboat here. Oftentimes when I do this, after making the plunge cut and slowly moving my way across the design, I'll keep part of the blade within the plunge stroke that I just made. I just kind of slowly rock my way in a particular direction. That helps keep it straight, and it helps keep your angle consistent as well as you carve along that particular stretch of the design. So I'll make a couple of passes here, and I'll clean it up with some smaller gouges, as this particular spot is pretty tight I'll just keep slowly working it down until I'm at the depth that I want to be. One thing that you do have to keep in mind when doing these stop cuts is not making too deep of plunge cuts or making those stop cuts, because that's going to create some gouge marks later when you need to do your undercutting. There's some areas in the carving that you need to do the undercutting. I guess you necessarily don't have to do any kind of undercutting, but that would be one stage of relief carving that I would strongly recommend that you do, because that just makes the carving pop that much more. But when doing these stop cuts, you have to keep in mind your depths, so then when you do your undercutting later, you're not going to have these gouge strokes or gouge marks that you have to spend a bunch of time cleaning up, and you end up going deeper than what you really want to go. In areas that you don't necessarily have to do any undercutting, you don't really have to worry about that as much. It's just good practice to do that, so then you don't run into any kind of issues later on in the carving. I find that it works really well to make that rocking motion or kind of a slicing motion as you make that stop cut or plunge cut. I just find that it cuts a lot cleaner, and you don't run into as many issues as far as the wood breaking or you having to muscle your way through it. So I just keep working my way around the sailboat here, making those stop cuts and cleaning it up. I oftentimes like to, during this stage, to keep it nice and clean. I'm relatively fussy here, making sure that I don't have any sort of fuzzies or any sort of imperfections here, because this is the final outline before you do your shaping and undercutting.